Hi, I'm Caite-Faith and
I am James.
And we are going to ask you questions.
So,
first question is, have you always been a reader yourself? And if so, are there any writers that you sort of look up to or admire?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just the way that is in To Kill a Mockingbird, that reading and breathing go together, that's always been the way that it has been for me. In fact, there's a very embarrassing family photo of me being potty trained and having taken my book with me to the bathroom. Now, a picture book, I hasten to add, I wasn't that advanced, but I was giving it a good go. Yes, and actually in terms of writers that inspire me, there's so many. I think when I was at your stage at school, I really loved the classics. I was heavy into Dickens, into Austen, into Hardy, and you can see that sense of drama in Remember the Round's plot. But today, contemporary writers that I love, my all-time favourite has to be Elizabeth Strout. So she is a Pulitzer-winning prize author, and she actually came to it quite late on. She wasn't published, I believe, until about her 40s, and she said it was a tough road to even get that far, but her work is so still, it's deceptively simple, and I started my writing career in poetry. Of course, Kathleen Raine, my protagonist in Remember the Round, is a poet, and I think that's in the Venn diagram between poetry and prose, that's where an author like Elizabeth Strout sits, and that's really my inspiration. It's much more, it's not about what's happening but why it's happening, and that's something that I would try as best I can to harness throughout my own writing career.
All right, so Remember the Round is your second novel, so just for the audience, how would you describe it and what would you say it's trying to achieve?
Yeah, so Remember the Round is inspired by the true story of what I call the some-requited love between the poet Dr. Kathleen Raine and the author naturalist Gavin Maxwell. So many people out there will have already come across Gavin Maxwell through Ring of Bright Water, his best-selling book, and it later became an international film. But what is relatively little known to this day is the fact that Ring of Bright Water took its title from one of Kathleen Raine's poems, with ambiguous acknowledgement, let's say, and they shared a very intense emotional, spiritual bond that lasted over 20 years, the span of the entire novel. But she's either been written out entirely from this story, or when she is included, it's really as an embarrassing little footnote in Gavin Maxwell's life. It's so reductive, so misogynistic, to the point that Kathleen Raine is actually accused of witchcraft as late as 1968. So when I came across them, I was outraged, firstly, that I hadn't heard of this woman before, that was such vision, such vitality. And then also the way that this was being told. It was so clear to me that there was another side to this story, and it's that injustice in the way that Kathleen Raine has been represented thus far that is really my mission at the heart of Remember the Round.
So how did you go about getting your novel published, and also was there any sort of like pushback from people who were like really into like Gavin Maxwell and his whole story? Like, I'm imagining people like being like, is this really the story we want to push about it, or was it just like smooth sailing?
That's a good question. So yeah, I think with the publication process, it's never fully smooth sailing, because you think, as a writer, when you were typing away at home, you think the tough part is going to be actually getting it finished, and then you realise that, yeah, that's a false summit, and now you have to actually find a publisher. So you send it out in submission, and I couldn't have been luckier to find Ringwood. They are a very small Glasgow-based publisher, and really it was a team of young women that all came together to nurture this story, to bring Kathleen's perspective to the light. In terms of the Maxwellian lobby, it did cross my mind. I would say I've been pleasantly surprised. So I think, to be honest, you're not going to be a huge fan of Gavin Maxwell and not know that he was something of a complicated character. His own biographer, Douglas Botting, had a great quote that never was the simple life pursued by someone so complicated. So I would imagine that anybody who is a real admirer of him, and I would include myself in that, Ring of Bright Water, and actually all of his work, it's very stylishly rendered. I think people would understand that. And in fact, a lot of people have encountered Kathleen Raine. Most people in Scotland, certainly, who have heard of her, have done so through Gavin Maxwell. I would say about 99% positivity. So, a great example at one end of the spectrum is that the Gavin Maxwell estate very kindly gave me permission to include one of Gavin's real life letters to Kathleen in the novel. That was incredibly generous, incredibly exciting. There have been, I'd say I've heard tell of a few online comments that were less so. Particularly, I've mentioned the witchcraft accusation, and when news of the book coming soon went online, there was a comment, crazy witch. Now, I don't know whether that was Kathleen, whether that was me, or whether it was a bit of both of us, but that... it was just actually more fuel to the fire. That is exactly what I'm here to do, what this book is here to do. So if one fewer person thinks of Kathleen Raine as a crazy witch, and one more person knows her as one of Scotland's greatest, most underrated poets by the time I'm finished, then I hope the book will have done its job.
Of course. So if she's mostly known kind of from a relationship through Maxwell, how would you say that's sort of affected her legacy? And how do you think the novel is going to sort of change that in the future?
It has hugely affected her legacy, and again I think particularly here in Scotland, because as part of my research for the novel I travelled to a number of locations that were key to her life, one of which is Great Bavington in Northumberland, where Kathleen grew up during the First World War, also Martindale and Ullswater, where she and her children took shelter during the Second World War, and I can see that they are making efforts to honour her legacy. In Ullswater Way, there are the Kathleen Raine poetry stones, and some of her words are carved on the lakeside there. It's exquisite. And yet here there's just nothing. And I think that she has been overshadowed by this Gavin Maxwell tale and the way in which it's been told after his death, and certainly after hers. Yes, I think I really hope that... I would always say you want more voices rather than fewer in literature, and Kathleen wrote very candidly about her feelings for Gavin Maxwell, so no doubt that she was happy for that to be out there, but the difference is that she blamed herself mercilessly for everything that had gone wrong in the relationship, and yeah, Maxwell tended to blame her too. So I wanted to bring a feminist consciousness, a feminist perspective, to just do her justice, to bring fairness back into the equation.
Yeah. And so how did you balance like staying true to the real life people and also the characters in your book? Because I feel like that would be sort of hard to, do you know what I mean? Like it would be hard to portray them accurately and also add this like sort of classical drama that you brought in.
It is, absolutely. I mean, I will say, I think they pretty much lived the plot. There was relatively little tinkering I had to do. And in fact, sometimes it was the opposite. They had such a volatile time together. Sometimes I'd have to almost pick my favourite fights. It would be one of these kind of cardiograms that it's all getting very erratic and you think you can't have them falling out every single page. But I think... yeah, it's always going to be tricky. I think the question of choosing to do it creatively rather than academically. But another author that I admire, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, she has spoken about the purpose of fiction is not just to tell what happened, but how it felt. And that is really why I've taken this perspective here. I want readers to actually walk in Kathleen's footsteps, to stand with her on the shore. She looks out for her and Gavin's little pet otter Midge, to stand beside their round tree and to feel her heartbreak. I could and do tell this story until I'm blue in the face, but it's so much more powerful. We often say in writing to show, don't tell, and it's more powerful if people can really empathise and experience the story with her. I would say there was relatively little that I had to change as such, and in fact sometimes it feels like fate has gifted you an incredible plot. I mean, we have characters, surnames like Raine and Payne, you couldn't really make them up. We also have a Gavin Young who was a real person, and I think my editor wouldn't let me get away with inventing somebody like that. And certain key scenes will take place at really important dates, so I think for whatever reason they lived a very dramatic life together.
It was just like perfect. Yeah.
It was, yes. It was perfect. Hopefully, a way to. She certainly endured a great deal throughout the course of this relationship. But yes, it does make for rather a good drama, I have to say. I think it was the emotional truth above all else is what I really wanted to come out, and hopefully the book achieves that.
And in terms of Kathleen's sort of art, her poetry, what would you generally say is kind of the ideas she expressed there and sort of her beliefs?
Yeah,
does that make sense? That's
a great question, because it's so relevant to why she's so drawn to Gavin Maxwell, why she stays in this relationship when it's causing her such angst. I think for Kathleen, there was always a tension between, I put it in the book as, being grounded on the earth and looking up at the sky. She was very drawn to not just like what life is, but what life could be. And that put her at odds with a lot of other writers at that time who were really drawn to a gritty realism. And in fact, she would say, what is more real than love? What is more powerful than the best of what humanity can be? So I think reconciling that vision with ordinary life, with motherhood, with marriage, with the fallibility of us all. That was tough for her. And she, as well as being an incredible poet, she was also a fantastic scholar. She specialised in William Blake, who that research does appear in the novel. And she was very informed by what we would call his Neoplatonic sources. So we hear about Platonic love all the time these days, and it seems like a sort of watered down version of a romance. It's a kind of like, oh, well, at least we'll have a friendship. But in fact, a true Platonic love would be, if anything, something greater than conventional romance. It would be two souls connecting. It would be spirit meeting spirit. And I think that is what she hoped and believed that she had found with Gavin Maxwell, and therefore the tougher it got, the more she dug her heels in and the more she committed to their connection.
Yeah, that's really like nice answer. But so I know we spoke about this a little bit before, but is it like difficult or easy to choose the right title, and also like the cover? Can you tell us a bit about that, like how the process was?
The cover in particular, because I can remember it was about this time last year when I went for the meeting with my publisher, and we were going over the contract, and I remember him saying, have you noted that word provisional beside the title? And of course you're so excited to be offered a contract, you think, wait, hang on, no, I had not. At that point, when I submitted the manuscript, it was called The Round Tree, because the round tree is a symbol, again, you couldn't make it up. It's an incredibly potent symbol at the very beginning of Gavin and Kathleen's relationship, right at the centre and indeed at the end. So I had quite merrily called it the round tree. I thought my job was done. But in fact, publishers have a far more kind of pragmatic perspective, and they could see that there were a number of books already out there in the world called The Round Tree that were nothing to do with these characters, nothing to do with this story. So they said to me, spend the Christmas holiday pondering what other options there would be, and of course I did. So Remember the Rowan actually comes from one of Kathleen's own poems. She wrote an epic poetic sequence of life, love, loss called On a Deserted Shore after Gavin Maxwell passed away. And she ends it, shall you and I in all the journeying of soul remember the round tree, the waterfall. So that phrase, remember the round, we still had the three words, and actually it felt even more perfect because it was her words. You know, something that had really stuck in my craw was the fact that Ring of Bright Waters, her words with Gavin Maxwell's name beside them, and so few people realise that. So I thought now we can really bring her front and centre.
Do it justice.
Exactly. So her words are on this title as well.
And certainly a lot of the media interest, for example, that Daily Mail article earlier, was sort of around the accusations of witchcraft against Kathleen Raine. So what are kind of your thoughts on how that happened as late as the 1960s?
Yeah, it's really shocking and quite sobering because, I mean, I think all of us know that Scotland has really been reckoning with our history of witchcraft. You know, we've had a pardon, there's talk of a national monument, but we think that belongs centuries ago. So it's really shocking to realise that this could be as late as the late 1960s. And even at Gavin Maxwell's funeral, there were people who wouldn't speak to Kathleen.
And even people commenting it as well.
Exactly, 2024. I don't know why I'm saying 1968. It's like, let's not let it be 2025, people. It utterly, it incenses me, quite frankly. And it's just how illogical it is. I mean, again, if we go back to titles, it's just as well that The Worst Witch was taken, because it's like, if you think this woman, surely the definition of a witch would be a woman who had everything her heart desired. If she had, and she says it, I have her saying it to Gavin in the book, if I had any control over your fate, Gavin, you would have known it long ago. You would have loved me as I love you. This story would have been a short story. It would have been Gavin Maxwell and Kathleen Raine married in the early 1950s, and I would have got 3 or 4 years of my life back. I think it's also incredibly gendered. Yet to see, certainly I know it is the case in other countries, but here I think a woman of passion, a woman of great emotion, only she will be accused of witchcraft. I mean, a lot of these traits she actually shares with Gavin Maxwell. He's just lauded for his sensitivity, his connection to the natural world. So it's just misogyny run rampant with that accusation then and now. So yeah, very glad that, as I say, hopefully if anybody begins the book believing that she's a witch, they certainly won't end it that way.
And we'll be leaving the witch talk in the past.
Yes, exactly.
So what is your personal opinion of Maxwell and Raine's relationship, and to what extent would you say it's incorporated in the novel?
Yeah, that has been the kind of raison d'etre of it all, and it's one of these things that I will never finish pondering it. And during the editorial process, I had a chief editor, Matilda, and then I had a number of assistant editors. And I remember us having these discussions about whether to come down on one side or another about what Gavin truly felt for Kathleen. And actually, I realised that she never knew. I'm not sure whether he ever knew. She lived her life not entirely sure whether he loved her the way that she loved him. So actually, we, in an exercise of empathy, we have to inhabit that space, that tension, that ambiguity as well. It depends what mood you're in, really. You can see it as relatively exploitative. You can see how her connections, facilitated his career to no end. Gavin Maxwell was not even a writer when they first met. He was a struggling portrait painter, and Kathleen had just published her third poetry collection, so incredibly connected. And Janet Adams-Smith, the editor of the New Statesman, who was one of the first to publish Gavin's work, she was the godmother of Kathleen's daughter Anna. So there are very practical threads there that you can think, oh yes, he was just after what he could get. But equally, there are very moving moments, very touching moments. One towards the end, which I won't mention its entirety so as not to spoil it, but he asks Kathleen to accompany him in spirit, and you can see that there are these glimpses of a spiritual connection between the two of them being recognised. But yeah, ultimately, I don't think she would have known. I don't think she could quite put into words what he felt. He certainly could. And to honour her, to honour that, that's where the book goes with it as well.
Yeah, and there's sort of, in the appendix, it's kind of mentioned that Kathleen Raine herself wasn't really a feminist, but sort of the book itself is a very feminist retelling. So kind of, what are your thoughts on that and sort of a relationship between Kathleen's own views?
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's something that did give me a sleepless night or two over the process of writing it, because, cut me open and I bleed feminism. This is really the motivation for all my creative work, as well as my professional work, quite frankly. So in an ideal world, yes, I would have been able to delve into the archive and find statement after statement of Kathleen's faith in the feminist cause, but in fact it was quite the opposite. She was at best ambivalent towards feminism, and at times there's quite an antipathy towards it, especially second wave feminism, which during the 1960s, that's what she would have been encountering. And that almost goes back to our earlier conversation about her beliefs, that she really wanted a spiritually centred life, so material campaigning, material concerns were not her priority. And she does raise some interesting points about that women can do better than becoming honorary men, which is a message that I think is a good one to echo through the centuries for us all. I actually came to realise that this was the thing I could offer this story. Kathleen, as I said, she wrote very, very candidly in her own autobiography about her feelings for Gavin Maxwell. So the question actually becomes, well, why not just push for that to be re-released and highlight that to everybody? But as I mentioned, she blamed herself relentlessly, mercilessly. And I felt that was so unjust. So actually my feminist consciousness could bring me to lend her a compassion that she couldn't give herself. So that's how I think it all comes to play in the novel itself.
So is that like the sort of feminist viewpoint that you brought to it? Was that what you sort of drew you to their story in the first point? Was the fact that she was so underrepresented as like her own artist? Was that what drew you to it, or was it other stuff as well?
No, that was exactly it. I mean, that really informs, as I say, all of my work. So published primarily short stories until this point, and they're all what I'd call historical fiction, because regrettably there's no shortage of amazing women who have not yet been given their time to shine in history or herstory. And yes, I was just really outraged at how reductive the portrayals of her were, and I think can genuinely make Scotland a better place by illuminating her work, by illuminating her vision. She herself wrote in On a Deserted Shore that if somebody was to open again the closed book of lives in which her life with Gavin was written, would not some essence pass, some chord tremble into the harmony of the spheres, lingering overtone of the remembered music that was ours? So I think she believed that it could have a positive impact, and I'm not going to dispute her.
So if even Kathleen's own autobiography is very harsh towards her, is there any sort of writing on her that you know of that's more sympathetic towards her in the way your book is, if that makes sense? Yeah,
absolutely does. So yes, in non-fiction in particular, I think there is a Raine renaissance underway. So there's a authorised biography of Kathleen's life, which is really thoughtful. It was a great source of inspiration for the novel. And there are emerging threads of women who feel like me, who are bringing her to the fore. So there's a scholar called Jenny Messenger who's writing about Kathleen and consciousness, because she really had this visionary approach to where the boundaries of herself and the natural world were. So that's going to be a fascinating book. And there's also a biography in the works about Helen Sutherland, who was Kathleen's close friend, who takes care of her children while she heads to London to make her fortune as a poetess, as they called it. So slowly but surely there is progress, but there's still a lot of work to be done. I had... In 2022, so when the novel was underway, I had applied to English Heritage for a blue plaque for Kathleen at Paulton Square, where she lived in London. And I did this application with Temenos, her charity. We heard back just a couple of weeks ago that we got pretty far, but regrettably not shortlisted because her profile was not high enough. Now, with all due respect to English Heritage, it's like, you know what would increase her profile? Maybe a blue plaque. But you can see that she's just not, she's not broken through to the level that she deserves, that I think poetry itself deserves. So I'm prepared to do anything I could. But yeah, there is definitely a growing body of, I call us raindrops, the Kathleen Raine fans. So there's a little cluster. We're making a storm cloud slowly but surely.
So about your sort of writing process, is there anything like particular that you do to like prepare yourself to write? So if you're like going to write for long periods of time or something, do you like get in a specific headspace? Do you go anywhere? Like
I wish I did, because actually what my main tip for aspiring writers out there is to not be too tight about it, because we are notorious procrastinators. If you say, I can only write with this pen, I can only write when, you know, the moon is waxing, it's like Mercury's in retrograde, whatever, you know, you're going to end up defrosting the fridge, you're going to end up doing anything other than actually putting pen to paper or starting to type, because it does take a lot of you. It's you need to be in a bold and a brave headspace, but the way to do that is nothing ever got written by not writing it. So I wouldn't say to people to, be too process obsessed with it. I tended to write, certainly with this, it was actually during the lockdowns. I wrote the first draft, so pretty much perched on my bed, just tapping away. It's funny because Kathleen wrote a lot in her later years on a typewriter, and I think my friends and family are just very glad that MacBooks have been invented, that I wasn't clacking away. I think I would have been put in the garden shed, only allowed out now, to be honest.
But Roald Dahl putting you in the garden shed.
Exactly, and come out when you've finished. I think I would tend to write, well, actually at that point I was working from home, so I would write kind of 8 to 9, then 5 to 6 because there was no commute. Those days have passed, regrettably. But really, I think any moment that you can would be my advice. And if you've only got 20 minutes, you will have 20 minutes more than you started with. And above all else, I think devote time to the work. So that can be just visualising, that can be, I've never been a great fan of being like, I will churn out 500 words in the next hour, or I will do 2,000 words today, because you know what, quite often they're not very good. It's quantity rather than quality. And that's not what we want. So I would just say wherever you can, and remember that it is a long road, so it doesn't have to be, don't let perfect be the enemy of good, because that first draft, I mean, there are definitely moments where I can see the first draft still shining through, but you will go over it an awful lot before it's done, so don't feel as if you have to get it perfect to get it started.
And in terms of how, because Kathleen lived for quite a long time after the relationship, Gavin sort of, there was a little moment in the book where there was some reconciliation before he passed, which was in the 60s?
1969 he died, and she lives almost another 34 years. So she passed away in 2003 at the age of 95. Yeah,
so from what you know or what you've read, do either of them kind of have regrets about how their relationship turned out?
I think that's a great question. I think Gavin will have certainly had moments where he regretted beginning it, quite frankly, because he seemed to, I think, he deserves compassion for a lot of what he went through as well, because this is a point, Gavin Maxwell was gay at a time when it wasn't legal for men to be so in Scotland, and actually homosexuality between men isn't legalised until 1980, so a good 11 years after he's died. So this was not a drill for him. This was a really, really hostile social environment, and it meant he couldn't be honest with Kathleen, he couldn't be honest with himself, and that's a big source of their suffering. So I think there's a kind of grand regret there, just actually as a nation, for what everybody went through. I think I'm kind of sorry to say that I think most of what Kathleen regretted was probably her own choices. As I say, she was so self-punitive, and felt that simultaneously that she had not loved him enough, not loved him in the right way, and then also let her poetry slide as a consequence of this great love, however imperfect. So yeah, ultimately they both deserve compassion, but whether they would have done anything different, Kathleen does write in her poetry about, recognising that what else could a person do. I laugh to know the death I must die is the way that she puts it. So I think she would have reconciled herself at the end of her life with how everything had gone. But that's not to say it didn't cause her a great deal of pain on the way.
The pain and rain rhyme again.
There it is. I know. See, the editor wouldn't let me away with it if I was making it up. But yeah,
given your work in libraries, they're clearly very rooted in like what you do and being an author as well. So are there any specific libraries which are very special to you?
Oh my gosh, well this one for sure, all of the South Lanarkshire libraries, because that is where I started. Wrote a fair bit of the novel, I must say. I was primarily in Blantyre Library, which is one of the ones that we have been campaigning against closure this year, because a lot of libraries, it's a tough landscape out there, and I'm passionate about advocating however we possibly can. It's a legal and a moral right for citizens to have public library access, so we need to make sure, if you take one message away from this podcast, please let it be that. But yeah, there are so many libraries that were integral to this story, and just made it infinitely richer. Glasgow Women's Library is a place where I love to write, and they do a great initiative called Women on the Wall, where you could donate towards their eco initiatives, and a woman's name would be put up on this grand staircase of incredible icons, and Kathleen Raine is now on it. So although I don't quite have my plaque for her yet, she is a woman on the wall. The National Library of Scotland was another really key source of inspiration for the novel, and you should see my little library card, because it was during lockdown, I had to wait to get into the reading rooms, and it's supposed to be a little passport photo, but I am beaming ear to ear. It's the goofiest photo because I was just so thrilled to be there. And I mean, I could shed a tear, you could laugh out loud. I mean, I read Gavin Maxwell's fan mail and it's just hilarious. In fact, going back to libraries, there's a little boy had written to him, because what's hilarious about his fan mail in the National Library is that I thought it would just be what people had written to him, but in fact, it was his response to his secretary of what he wanted her to tell the fan. So a little boy had written and said he was doing a project on otters and could he have some more information? And Gavin Maxwell wrote back, "Tell that wicked and presumptuous child to show some initiative and go to his local public library. I'm not writing his thesis for him." And then you have the poor secretary. "This is really rather a vague question, Have you thought of going to the library?" Trying to put it in sort of palatable terms. But I mean, it should be shouted from the rooftops what we can access. You couldn't put a price on it. So the fact that it's free is just dizzying. I mean, I've sat there in their reading rooms with the fair copy of Ring of Bright Water, and it is dappled with water specks, where Gavin Maxwell wrote this out with the otter playing at his side. I mean, as I say, it truly is priceless resources. So we really need, this is a point at which I think libraries have never appeared more radical than they do now, quite often the only non-clinical, non-commercial space left in a community. So it's more important now than ever that we fight for our right to access them.
So in terms of after the debut of this novel, are you in any position to tell us what's next? What's coming next from you?
Yeah, absolutely. So as of this week, I have a poetry collection confirmed. So that is going to be coming out at the start of next year. And there's a Sandaig series within it. So poems that I wrote while the manuscript was taking shape. And I'm also working on an edited anthology of feminist librarianship. This will be the first time in the UK that there's been a feminist librarianship text. So that will be, I'm not going to call non-fiction a palate cleanser, but it'll be a different kind of research.
Sure.
And I do have an idea for what's next. I've always said throughout that there could never be a replacement for Kathleen Raine. There could never be another woman to follow her. But I might have just found two. So that will be they will be hopefully appearing in the next novel in a little while.
We'll keep an eye out for them.
Yes.
So what tips do you have for young people? Because I myself am quite a writer, and sometimes it's really hard to get started or really. So what tips do you have for young people who want to pursue that?
Yeah, I think every single writer that you read will have felt the same. I know Kathleen Raine did. I certainly do. It's a daunting prospect, that blank page. So I think, as I said earlier, get something down, and then it's almost think of it as sculpture rather than painting. You're not starting on a blank canvas. You're actually starting with the raw material.
A big lump of clay.
Exactly, and you're chiseling it down into something slightly more polished. And there is, I truly believe, if we want plurality in literature, if we want democracy in literature, there's space for everybody's voice. So you have a perspective to contribute, and it is unique to you. So don't feel, I think some of the most hollow writing out there is when it's mimicry, when it's somebody trying to catch on to someone else's style because they actually don't have the confidence in their own. So I think about what you're passionate about. I mean, you can tell from the way I talk about this that it's the passion that really gets you through. And equally, conversely, if a piece of work is boring you, it'll probably bore readers as well. So trust your instincts with it. Listen to your inner voice, and let that become your outer voice.
Now, I remember when we asked Margaret MacDonald this in the last interview, she said that in her career she'd abandoned something like 4 book concepts in her entire life.
Was it not 14? She had like 14 past novels.
Oh,
yeah.
wow.
Can you beat that number?
She was a prolific writer, and she always said, rush through to the end. So in terms of how you write, would you say you finish most of your manuscripts and ideas? And did most of them get developed through to the end?
That's a great question. Well, I certainly cannot compete with Margaret's 14. I do have one idea for a contemporary novel that it hasn't quite been the right time. I'm not sure whether... I think the moment will present itself, because as I say, it sounds incredibly trite. It's like dating advice. When you know, but you kind of do know when the topic and the moments are aligned. I'm the sort of writer that I will really polish as I go. So I will work quite a good deal on one chapter, even on one paragraph before I move on. So it's not the quickest process, but it does mean that things, if I leave something, I'm relatively happy with the condition in which it's in. I mean, something that is fascinating is that sometimes the story will tell you what form it wants to take. I mean, this actually began as a short story, and I thought, I had a particular place in mind that I was submitting it to, and their word limit was 3,500 words. Now, you can probably guess that the novel is well above that. And I was just hitting my head off this word limit. I was like, there's more to say. And so I thought, I had a long weekend. I was like, I'll give it a go. And then 4 years later, here we are. So I think also being open to that is really valuable. Maybe there's something that a poem that belongs as prose, as vice versa. Something might suit a screenplay, something might fit a musical, if you're hearing it in a very lyrical way. So being open to different forms it can take. But I think my dusty draft drawer is not too full, but it certainly is. The struggle to juggle is real these days, so I'm not sure. Not that I want to wish us all into another lockdown, but it was good for writing conditions, so we'll see. I might take a bit longer next time.
It's always easy to reminisce on it. When I was in it, I was like stir crazy, and now it's like,
completely.
Nice.
Yes, that's definitely not what we want, but maybe just the odd writing retreat to get the balance.
So in one of your earlier blog posts, you posted like a bookcase shelfie, which is quite a clever pun, and then it was a tour of your bookcase, and I just want to know if there was any more books up there that have made their way up in the past few years.
There's tons. I know the video you mean. And I'm sure shelfie was, if not stolen, then certainly borrowed from my library colleagues, because it is a cute term. Again, I think the entirety of Elizabeth Strout is somebody that I would just invariably add to my bookshelf. Sarah Sheridan as well, if anybody hasn't read her work yet, I could not recommend her highly enough, and you'll see that she very, very generously has given Remember Rowan a cover endorsement. I can't put into words how much I love Sarah's...
fangirling?
Oh, total fangirl. She is a historical writer as well, but brings it to life in such a visceral, vivid way. We actually had a Book Week Scotland event not 2 days ago together, and I would really say that Sarah is a reader's writer. Person after person coming up to her at the end saying, I didn't think I enjoyed this era until I read this. I didn't want it to end. There's no greater compliment than people simultaneously staying up to midnight to finish a book and then also not really wanting to reach that final chapter. And Sarah's most recent book, The Secrets of Blythewood Square, is set in Glasgow, which is a city that I know and love very well. So I think it's always a treat when you can kind of walk with the characters and somebody who gets that balance right between storytelling and research is very admirable to me. So yeah, all of Sarah's and her non-fiction text, Where Are the Women, gets a special mention because it was one of the few that actually included Kathleen Raine. As I've said, it's very rare that Kathleen gets showcased in her own right, but that was one that did it. So yeah, there's many, but I'd have to check my library record to be honest to know all the ones that have been added since then. But yeah, there's no shortage of inspirational writing out there, happy to say.
Of course, and you also, in addition to writing great novels, also do poetry and artistry, or painting, maybe that's a better word for it. So in terms of how do those interlink with writing novels, and what advice would you have for people who sort of want to pursue something in that as well?
Yeah. Well, you can see that my passion for poetry found its prose channel very well in Remember the Rowan, and the novel that I'm thinking of next is going to be an artistic one. So you never know where these passions will collide. I think you have to be open to kind of an ebb and flow in creativity. At the start, I was kind of writing as a hobby and painting professionally, and now it's very much switched over. That it's a rare day that I get time to draw or paint, but that means it's more recreation when I do. I think a lot of the arts really speak together. It's perhaps most important thing is having that creative mindset and being open to it. I think we all have that within us. And then there's no shortage of creative ways to be creative, whether it's dance, whether it's gardening, whether it's something that I can't think of off the top of my head. They combine very readily. You'll know that there's a scene in Remember the Rowan, Kathleen's first trip to Sandaig, which was Gavin Maxwell's home in the West Highlands. It's known as Camusfern and Ring of Brightwater. She goes with her great friend Winifred Nicholson, who was an immensely talented artist. And I imagine this scene, because we know that it really happened, of Kathleen sat on the shore writing her poetry while Winifred is painting. So I think that's symbolic of how the arts can speak to one another, because ultimately that's what it's about. It's about humans communicating with one another.
So the book is associated with the book. The phrase is, if hate were love, if love were hate, it could not make our story untold. And what would you say is the significance of this phrase to you and the meaning of the novel? Yeah,
again, this is actually Kathleen Raine's own words, and it's like I couldn't make it up. I couldn't put it better than she did, in a poem that's titled In Answer to a Letter Asking Me for Volumes of My Early Poems. So that kind of does what it says in the tin. You can get what Gavin Maxwell was up to at that point. And what really struck me with that quote is that in this relationship there is intense love, there is intense hate, but when she says it could not make our tale untold, it recalls us, it reminds us that the truth will out, and that is the whole truth. So when there have been these partial retellings, that her perspective was always there waiting to have a light shone in it. So that's why that quote has really, really resonated with me throughout.
Sure. And now I think we could open up the floor to any questions from the audience who've managed their way out here, even considering how Baltic
in this horrible weather.
Yes. So any questions from the audience at all?
Yeah, I have a question. So Kirsten, I mean, you've spoken so beautifully about Kathleen, and you seem to have such a connection with her. If you could meet her, and it seems like always tantalising, and I know she obviously lived for quite a long time, what would you say to her?
Oh my gosh, I have given this a lot of thought. And you know, the strangest thing is, I can't imagine meeting her and her not knowing I've done this. I just get the sense that she's been present throughout. I would say that I don't hear the poems here, I hear them here. And now for the podcast, I was pointing to my ears first and then my heart. And I would hope that she would know what I meant. I don't know that she would appreciate me ranting about Gavin Maxwell.
She's like, this is my life.
I know, exactly. And maybe she'd be like, those blooming feminists at it again. She'd probably scold me. But she did really love Scotland. She was half Scottish herself and had Scottish ancestry through her mother's side. So I think that would have hopefully been in my corner. Yeah, it's dizzying, and you're right, because she had such a wonderfully long life. There are a number of people I've spoken to, one very dear to me indeed, who have met Kathleen, who did meet her in her later years, and she had this legendary afternoon tea in Paulton Square that just sounds epic, with her beloved cat Daisy Bell. She didn't have an altar at that point.
Woman.
Exactly, mine too. But yeah, I think it would just be as simple as that, but I honestly can't imagine that she wouldn't already know. I don't know whether it's just the wisdom that she brought in life. She has an omnipotent energy to me, but I feel as if, there would be nothing I could say to her that she doesn't already know at this point. It's a great question. And actually, when we're saying about pushing through the snow, Kathleen attended, when going back to libraries, the opening of the Scottish Poetry Library. It's just, I think, marking its 40th anniversary this month, perhaps even. And that was a blizzard. And she'd got all the way from London up to Edinburgh in a blizzard. So that was her own commitment too. So thank you to everybody who did the same tonight.
And the trains are so weird as well. I don't know if she managed to get like a train there or something.
Probably would have been, yeah. You'll see trains are quite important.
Like
a lot of writing went on.
One snowflake on the track and they're like, sorry, you can't go.
I don't know if they were more robust back then, but yeah, that's definitely the case now, sadly.
Have we got any more questions from the crowd?
You've got a few English teachers in the room.
Yeah.
Where would you suggest that a teacher starts with her work?
Oh, great question. I think the beautiful thing about Kathleen's over is that she published 11 full poetry collections throughout her life, as well as her 4 volumes of autobiography. She's incredibly prolific. And that means that you can find poetry of pretty much every length. Everything from On a Deserted Shore, which is 1 poem, it's an entire volume's worth, to actually just 2 lines. And some of those are my favourite lines of all time. To make the imperfect perfect, it is enough to love it. Even those 2 lines up on the board, and I think just to find out what young people thought, because I think there's something incredibly timeless about her perspective. So there's going to be something there, because we all know what it is to feel imperfect and we all know what it is to love. Nature, as is probably very apparent from everything from the book cover to everything I've said tonight, was a profound source of inspiration for her. So actually I think taking her words outdoors would also be really powerful, really valuable. I mentioned the Ullswater Way poetry stones, and that feels so appropriate that they are there in the lakeside, that they're not kind of shut up in a museum, because that is, I think, where a lot of her writing quite literally took root. So yeah, I think if in doubt, maybe start small, but sometimes those small ones, they say it all. And don't be afraid for a walk in Kathleen Raine's footsteps.
Can I ask one thing?
Of course, yeah.
It struck me as a really strange look of serendipity that there's so much of a focus on otters at the moment.
There is.
The documentary which has come out of the National Geographic documentary, I think. And yeah, I wondered, have you ever seen an otter? You speak about their pet otter, Midge. So when would you like to see an otter?
Yes, it's so funny. I've been asked otter questions a few times this week, so they are definitely in the atmosphere. Somebody asked me what I would call my pet otter if I had one. You're like, well, if there's one message of this book, it's like, don't have a pet otter, okay? But yes, I actually, so I've got a fantastic friend, Heather, who works at Calderglen Zoo, not far from here at all. So she actually had me up during the research process to meet their otters, Harry and Bella. Meet behind the perspex, I should say, because again, the message of the book is that they can be quite a volatile little creature. They're very, very cute, but I certainly wouldn't want to.
They hold hands, but they also attack you. So
that was literally what she said to me. Yeah. So I don't envy them sharing their bath with Midge back in the day, although they'd had him since a cub or a pup. But they call it a cub for some reason, so I followed suit with Gavin Maxwell. But yeah, that was so epic to actually see them, and they brought me a little stone up to the glass, and I've got a great photo of their paw and us kind of joining hands, joining paws, because again, you just can't, that's not really something that can be achieved any other way. How can we imagine having an otter scurrying around, an otter in our lives? There is also, if anybody wants to head onto YouTube, there's a terrific, it's just a couple of minutes long, a news item about Gavin when he first brought Midge the otter back from Iraq to London, and it's one of these pathy kind of news. It's very, and the announcer talks like this. It's all very Queen's, and the author has a otter in his bathtub, and you can see Midge kind of like knocking over the milk and in the waste paper basket and everything. So that was also a good source of what Gavin's flat had looked like. But yeah, I think I've not yet seen one in the wild. My mum has. She's seen one at Pollock Park, and then it's like everybody texts me. Anybody that in my wider circle that does encounter an otter, they do WhatsApp me just for maximum jealousy. So hopefully at some point.
It's like, hey, just seen an otter, by the way.
I know, just to make me feel worse. But yeah, so Harry and Bella, they're in the acknowledgements. It's probably, you can tell I'm an animal lover from the acknowledgements, because I think at last count we had 3 dogs, 2 otters and a donkey who had contributed to.
What did the donkey have?
Oh, Dorabella. So much love for Dorabella. So Dorabella lives next door in Great Bavington to the manse where Kathleen lived during the First World War, where she was brought up. So I went down to the church where she would have worshipped, and I was wandering around in the grounds, and then, oh, who's this in the field next to me? But Dorabella the donkey. So me being me, of course I go over to talk to the donkey, and her wonderful owner Muriel came out. She was giving her carrots, got a good, then I went in for a cup of tea, because actually Muriel's house is one in which Kathleen would have known back in the day, because Great Bavington is it's a tiny village, and it's virtually unchanged. You can still very much see the bones of what Kathleen would have known and loved back then. So yeah, Dorabella, she opened doors for me, that donkey. She really contributed to the novel, so it was only right that she made it into the acknowledgements.
Any other questions? Or
Can I ask you, how much of Kathleen Raine's material remains in print today? Is she quite accessible?
Yeah, that's a good question, and regrettably not. So her collected poems are still in print. They were. They're now with Faber and Faber, and they very generously gave me permission to cite a number within the novel, so we have her real words throughout. All the 11 poetry collections themselves. So what I didn't realise when I started my research was that in a collected poems, it very much does what it says in the tin. Every poem does not make the cut, and she was quite ruthless with herself. So as I then acquired the vintage copies of her original collections, it was no end of rediscovery to find poems that have not seen the light of day for a long time. All her autobiographies are also out of print, so they can be found. I'd ask your local library, of course. They can be found in vintage booksellers and the like, but we're definitely, I think it's part of the Raine Renaissance. I'd like to see more out there, because they're incredible. I mean, the raw, radical honesty that she brings to her autobiographical writing, for instance, I mean, that was really what sparked me on this mission. She's incredibly candid, and that to this day remains rare in writing, so I would highly recommend her. And there is quite an extensive, I've kept put in the author's note my research sources, so you will find it's not a big enough book in its own right, but there is further reading to be found if anybody's interested, which hopefully they will be.
are there any kind of rights issues with the rest of our work? Like, who do we have to talk to get this published?
Have to talk to Messrs Faber and Faber, and they are very strict. So yes, so what you do if you're going to cite so Kathleen Raine is no longer alive, but her literary estate is held by Faber and Faber. So there will tend to be a publishing house or a person that has those rights. I believe it's 75 years. Somebody in the library can probably keep me right on that. After 75 years, things in Britain go out of copyright. So that's why we can all cite Shakespeare, we can cite William Blake himself without having to pay anything. Yes, exactly. But for people in this time period, what you would do is, it tends to be done online, so you would write the manuscript first, you'd know what you would like to cite, and then you will request permission, and they very generously did allow that, because something that Ring of Bright Water opens with part 2 of Kathleen's The Marriage of Psyche, The Ring, her poem in its entirety. But until very, very, very recently, and many editions this is still not the case, her name was nowhere near that page. It was buried in the acknowledgements. Her collection was mistitled. So when you listen to the audiobook, for example, it sounds like Gavin Maxwell wrote the darn poem himself. So it was really important to me to have that poem right in the front of my own book, but to have her name attached. But you require the permission to do that. So copyright is important, but they are, it's in everybody's interest if they care about these writers to want their words out there. So you just you do the right thing, and then hopefully lets readers, a new generation, enjoy your words too.
Of course. Any other questions from the audience? Or
Well, thank you very much, Kirsten. That was thank you.
Yes, my goodness.
It was so lovely
thank
to
you.
talk to you, because
Oh, we could have gone on for another hour, but we'd get snowed in. I think I did.